Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about early photography. I'll be totally honest here, this is not my strongest subject. We have a lot of great professors at UVU who teach photography. You'd probably get a much better history of photography from them than you would from me. But I have to talk about it. And the reason I have to talk about it is because photography changed the world. It was the first truly new medium to arrive in Western art in more than 350 years. Maybe you could consider oil painting as a kind of new revolutionary medium, but this is revolutionary even beyond that because of the nature of the way images are made in photography. They are made from the originals, so they capture perfectly the essence of the original, the form of the original. In fact, they capture it so perfectly that there was this intense debate about whether this should be regarded as an art form or not. It's funny, we take it for granted that photography is an art form. But back then, there was this intense debate that, well, maybe it isn't an art form. Maybe it's just a mechanical form of reproduction and shouldn't be regarded as an art form. And so it actually had to fight for its status. It also dramatically changes the way we view images. If you can make an image instantly, well, not quite instantly, some of these photographs took hours. If you could make an image quicker than you could with a painting, and it could be more accurate, what was the point of painting? And so photography not only opened up a whole new area of visual expression, it made us rethink all the other areas of visual expression as well. So that's why I want to focus on photography, on how it fundamentally changed the world. And without photography, without this incredible technological innovation, we probably wouldn't have had modernism, because it throws everything else that we thought we knew about painting into doubt. So it's important to know that photography itself has a very, very long history. For centuries, people knew that you could copy images directly from life. People had, in the Middle Ages and in the ancient Greeks and also with the Arabs, in Muslim civilization, they had figured out that you could transfer briefly the silhouette of something to a piece of chemically treated paper. But no one could figure out how to make those images permanent. By the 18th century, people had figured out how to make contact prints of like flowers or leaves or silhouettes of things. But again, these were just silhouettes. They were not fully formed images. And so it takes the early 19th century experiments to actually make it work. And the people that we credit for inventing this are going to be two Frenchmen, Joseph Nicephore Niepce and Louis Daguerre. And Daguerre is the assistant to Niepce, but they were the first to actually work in creating photographs. And it was very, very simple. This is probably regarded as the first photograph, and it's not much to look at. So what we are looking at is a very long-term exposure. Niepce took this picture out of his window, and the exposure took more than 10 hours. In fact, you can actually tell that because if we look at the picture, you can see that you have a tower here, and the light is shining this direction that way, but the light is shining this direction that way. That in the time it took to actually capture this image, the sun had moved across the sky. It's incredibly grainy, you can hardly make out the detail, but it was an excellent proof of concept. It proved that you could reproduce images by capturing them. Daguerre, his assistant, was the one who really actually pushed this forward and made the first commercially viable process, a process by which you could duplicate images. These images, however, took an enormous time to expose and to develop. And so the first ever photograph of a human being is this photograph here. This was a photograph taken out of his window on the busy Parisian street. And you're looking at this and you're saying, busy, but there's nobody there. Because it took such a long time for these exposures to take, you can't see all of the people walking up and down the street or all the carts and horses going down the street because they moved too quick to be captured. The only person that stood long enough to actually be captured is this individual who's having his boots shined there on the street. He was the only person that stood still long enough during the 20 minutes or more it took to take this exposure. So even between Niepce and Daguerre, you see this rapid increase and development in technology, that we go from exposures taking, half a day to exposures taking 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Daguerre immediately starts applying this process to taking pictures of still lifes, and he actually commercializes this. The Daguerre process produced the daguerreotype, and it was the first commercially available process. And in the late 1830s, this spread like wildfire all across the Western world, Europe, and eventually to the United States. And little stores were opened to make daguerreotypes. It was still very labor intensive, it was very expensive, and it only produced one unique image. You had to have a chemically treated glass plate, and at the end of this, you didn't have something that you could produce multiple images from. You had a single image. So every single image was unique. That made it very expensive. But we see a rapid development in technology once the actual proof of concept it happens. And that's where we get into William Henry Fox Talbot. William Henry Fox Talbot is a scientist, and he invents the calotype. And the calotype comes from two words that are taken from the Greek, kalos for beautiful and typos for image or impression. And his was a specially treated paper, but the paper produced a negative image. That negative image could then be pressed against a positive, and that positive exposed to light, producing the positive image. Now this means that instead of having a unique glass print, every time you wanted to make an image, you now could make multiple copies. And so now photography was like printmaking. It had this ability to produce multiple prints. And this is what really makes photography explode. Talbot for himself even recognized the kind of qualities of this, that he recognized you could make images that were emulating painted images. And so he took still lives like this. Again, what's interesting with Daguerre and with Talbot is you see them emulating the conventions of the previous era. They are taking the conventions of painting and transferring them to photography. This open door with a broom, etc. This is very reminiscent of Dutch interiors. That's clearly what he was trying to emulate. So this rapid expansion of technology really revolutionizes things. And I can't explain this enough. The best analogy I can give is to cell phones. I was a kid who had a dad in the 80s who actually had a cell phone. My dad was a physician. He was often on call, and so he had a cell phone. It was a gigantic Motorola block. It was the size of a brick. It cost him $1,000 a month. It didn't get very good reception, and of course you couldn't play Angry Birds on it. And it was not very many people had a cell phone back in the 80s. It was only the people who needed that. Well, that was the way photography was in the 1830s and the 1840s. If you have a photograph of one of your ancestors from the 1830s or 40s, chances are they were probably a very important person or a very wealthy person to have the chance to have that kind of photograph taken. But if you were if you have an ancestor and you have a photo of them and that photo comes from the 1850s, well, congratulations, so does everybody else. Because by the 1850s, the tintype, the album in print, and different technologies came in, and suddenly photography was ubiquitous. And it's exactly like cell phones. In the 80s and early 90s, almost nobody had cell phones. By the late 90s and early 2000s, everybody had a cell phone. And by 2007, the smartphone with the iPhone came out, and now everybody has a kind of version of the smartphone. They're just ubiquitous. It's an incredibly short period of time. So the technology really was rapid and revolutionary. It was slow in its initial process, but very, very quickly developed. And the processes that were slow and laborious, where you had all these multiple stages and chemical baths, quickly gave way to faster and faster techniques and technology. In the early days of photography, you actually have to have a vise to put somebody's head in to prevent them from moving, because the exposures are, you know, more than 20 minutes at a time. It's really, try holding still for 20 minutes. That'll give you a sense of what it was like. Travis Lovell, who teaches photography, is actually working with Paul Adams, who's a photography teacher out of BYU, and they're doing a series where they're capturing tintypes of the last native speakers. We're losing Native American languages at a precipitous rate, and so they're looking for people who are the last speakers of these languages, and they decided to do it through a tintype process. So this enormous box camera that they carry around, and they've had to resort to putting people's heads in vices like they did 150 years ago, just to get this shot. So they're using this very old tintype technique. Well, the technology rapidly improved, so that by the end of the 19th century, exposures were down to a matter of seconds. Even still, when you think about, a photograph today is taken in a fraction of a second, keeping something seconds seems like a ridiculous, a long period of time. But when you compare that to the 20 minutes or hours it used to take before, it was a huge improvement. And so photography rapidly spread. So what did this do to the visual arts, and what was the impact on the visual arts? It's clear that photography moved into the territory that painting used to occupy. So let's talk about how painting was used and how photography took over so much of that territory. One of the first areas I want to talk about is portraiture. One of the main purposes of academic naturalism was to capture likeness, and likeness of very important peoples, elites, notables, royalty, presidents, as you can see. And suddenly photography comes in and has the ability to take that instantly. And photography takes over the principal feature of capturing likeness for posterity. So if you think of great and notables like, Napoleon at the early 19th century, or George Washington, if you look into any textbook about them, you're going to see images of paintings, because those paintings are in fact the only thing that we had. But crack open a history book and move it to the time of the Civil War, and even though there were painted portraits of Abraham Lincoln made, you'll see there's a decided preference for the photograph. The photograph is seen as being more authentic, more direct, and in many ways more candid, more earnest. And so photography takes over the main role of portraiture, and it pretty much has that role today. Now we live in a world where if you sit down for a painting, that's pretty rare. It's only really exceptional things that a person will sit for a painting. Portraits are photographs. That's the way we think of them this way. And that's the way it happened then. So here we have a daguerreotypist at work showing off his work. And once you get to the 19th century, when we look for images of individuals, most likely they're going to be looking for photographs. So when we look at famous individuals like Edgar Allan Poe, or even ordinary individuals, we'll be seeing photographs. And so the portrait is one of the first acceptable uses of photography. People instantly recognize the value of this. If the purpose of a painting is to capture likeness, nothing captures likeness like a photograph. And so portraiture is elevated in photography pretty darn early. And you have people like Nadar. Nadar is this famous French portraitist who himself was a painter and an experimental. He was also an incredible inventor. He invented a whole dark room that he could go up into his balloon. Now, this was actually shot in a studio, but he actually did go up in a balloon, and he was the first person to take aerial photographs. Here's a view of a dark room. He had an entire dark room built out of wicker so that he could ascend and take his photographs and process his photographs from the balloon. He even had a horrific crash. But the result were some of the first and stunning aerial photographs. And if you think about this, no one had ever seen something like this before. This was truly revolutionary. In fact, he even gets made fun of in local cartoons. This is a very fun cartoon by Daumier. Daumier is making fun of him. Here is Nadar in his balloon taking a photograph, and the caption says, Nadar elevating photography to art. So that's a good dad joke for you. The pun is that he's saying, Nadar, you schmuck, just because you're elevating it physically, that doesn't mean that it's art. And I love the little other dig here is that you notice that everywhere below him is a photography studio. It's very clear that Daumier thought photography was a fad, that it wasn't really this great elevation of art. But Nadar also was a great portraitist, and he took portraits of some of the great and notables of his time, the very famous actress Sarah Bernhardt, the printmaker Gustave Doré, and he also took a portrait of Delacroix, the great romantic painter. And he also captures notables like critics and poets like Zola and Baudelaire. And these become the definitive images. It's interesting as you look at these images is that he often poses his figures as if they were posing for painted portraits. Again, they follow the conventions of the previous era. But it gives a vitality that you don't see in painting. Because it's made directly from the person, it can capture a little bit more of their character, at least if you're a sensitive photographer. And this brings us to the other area that photography began to excel in. Photography began to make inroads into history painting. That is, if you were trying to record an important historical event before this, your options were basically to paint it out. But in photography, you can capture that historical event in the actual moment, which means that a photograph isn't just a record of history, it is somehow history itself, and sometimes captures things that you would never expect. So a painting like The Surrender at Breda or Benjamin West's fabulous painting of the death of General Wolfe are compositions. They are constructs. They're clearly synthetic. They're composed in a studio. He composed the elements. This is not something that anybody saw at the time. But when you see some of the famous photographs of Matthew Brady, when he captures photographs of Abraham Lincoln speaking to his generals after the disastrous battle at Antietam, and speaking in a tent to McClellan, who was, reticent and refused to push the advantage of the Union armies, this is more than just a construct. Now, I mean, photographs are still constructs in a way. There was a very famous 1960s documentary said the camera never blinks. And then somebody actually said, yeah, but it does have tunnel vision. The idea that a camera only captures the truth is false. Cameras have always been, people have been photoshopping, engaging, what we would call photoshopping, engaging in deceptive photography ever since the beginning of photography, sometimes for fun and sometimes to genuinely deceive. So you have to be careful. But the sense of immediacy that you get from photography, that sense of earnestness, is definitely there. Yeah, you can crop things out and you can, airbrush people out of pictures, but generally what you see is what you get, and people recognize that. One of my favorite examples of this is this wonderful picture of the Lincoln's second inaugural address, and here you see a Lincoln. And most historians think that this character here is actually John Wilkes Booth, who actually attended this. So this is just shortly before John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. That's astonishing. And it captures a level of history and immediacy that painting just can't. You especially see this in the photographs of people like Timothy O'Sullivan, Gardner, Matthew Brady. These were photographers who went out to the battle site. For the first time, instead of seeing a battle in its aftermath through rose-colored glasses, I mean, think about this. When you look at something like war through a painting, you're going to be seeing the artist's vision. That artist is commissioned by the winners of that battle, so you're going to see a singular view of that battle. And it's often going to be rather propagandistic. There's no other word for it. But when you see something like this, something that has this immediacy, it's going to give you a very, very different feel. When Matthew Brady started taking these photographs, he would put them up in his studio in Washington, D.C., and a writer from the Washington Post said, who went to go see some of these photos, said, if Matthew Brady hasn't dragged the dead into our own living rooms, he's done the very next best thing. And I think you can see why. Now, again, a word of caution. When we see these war dead spread out across the battlefield, we now know that Matthew Brady and some of these others would arrive at the battle, sometimes when the battle was being cleaned up and bodies were being gathered in wagons, and when people weren't looking, they would drag the bodies out of the wagons and arrange them in the field so they could make it more dramatic. That's rather macabre and from a perspective of photojournalism would be unethical today, but it does mean you have to take these with a grain of salt. Sometimes they would come across the bodies and they didn't want the body to be face down, so they would roll the body face up so that you could see the face. So even then, you know, the manipulation is in the staging of the photograph. And you always have to, it's funny, our generation is very cynical about photographs because we live in the age of digital images and Photoshop. But for a long time, people were not as cynical as photographs as much as they should have been. There's always some kind of manipulation. Sometimes the manipulation is behind the camera. Sometimes it's in front of the camera. But there's no denying this has a real evocative power that something like a painting just wouldn't have. And even when it comes to subjects that you would think painting would dominate, like narrative subjects or storytelling or allegory, well, photography jumped in there too. You have wonderful photographs like this, The Two Ways of Life, which was a series of allegorical photographs that show an individual here judging between two different views of life, one that is dedicated to prayer and study and reason and to charity and helping individuals, and the other one, of course, which is, you know, given to debauchery, gambling, orgies, all of that stuff. And so here we have Rolander, who is, you know, making moral commentary on this scene. This picture itself was composed of 32 separate different photographs. So this is Photoshop circa 1857. We're already putting in and manipulating photographs in this way. Here's another example of one. This is another example by Henry Peach Robinson. This is Fading Away. And in the case here, we have a young girl who's obviously dying, perhaps of tuberculosis or consumption. You know, we're watching her fade away. And the father is against the window, you know, in grief, but resigned to the fact that he's about to lose his daughter. This, too, also is a composite photograph. It's not made of a single photograph. These individuals were shot separately, and then the artist kind of, you know, snipped them in and very carefully hid the edges. It's really kind of amazing that he was able to do that, but put that all together. So everything about this picture, and of course this picture, is phony. It's fake. It's staged. It's set dressing. It's, you know, manipulation after the fact. But it tells a story. It tells a narrative story. So it even can do what painting did so well. This first era of painting in this way, of photography in this way, came to be called pictorialism. And it was the first movement that really convinced people that, yes, photography is an art form. Photography can tell stories and raise the moral spirit and inspire people to the same level that painting can. And it did it by, again, mimicking the conventions of painting. You know, people realize, okay, you know, so if you capture the image through paint or you capture it through photography, what you're really doing is you're telling a story. You're creating an image. You're creating a sensation or a feeling or telling a story or a narrative. One of the more famous examples of this is Julia Margaret Cameron, who didn't pick up a camera until I think her 40s. And she created these wonderful staged photographs where she dressed her figures in costume. and created these elaborate kind of tableaus. Sometimes she would create props and dresses for people. She'd take portraits of little kids but put wings on them so they look like little cupids or angels. She would smear grease onto the lens to make it foggy, to give it a kind of hazy appearance, so she could mimic the qualities of atmospheric perspective in camera. And so they developed a whole series of tricks, but again, these tricks were there to, again, emulate painting. But there's another way photography impacted painting, and that was on the painting side, in the studio side. Some of the greatest academic painters realized the value of photography, that if you wanted to paint from life, that was the way you got at authenticity, was painting from life, from painting from reference. But there's a problem with painting from life, and that is your models get tired. If they're nude in a studio, they could get cold. That's also... there's also the moral issue of having nude models in a studio. And they also they move. It's hard to repose somebody over and over again. I don't know if you've ever drawn a model from life. I've actually, in a few times, been in a drawing class, and when we didn't have models, we would draw each other. Never nude, of course. We would be clothed. But we would, all take turns sitting in a chair for everybody else in the drawing class. And I tell you, it's really hard to hit your marks again and again and again and hold that pose. People would get angry at you. You'd put what we call spike tape on the floor so you knew where your foot was or where the chair was, and not move the light. And so all of that is just hugely inconvenient. And artists themselves began to realize, well, screw this. I'll just take a photograph, and the photograph doesn't change. That way my reference is always the same. And a lot of artists did this, and a lot of artists lied about it. Some of the most famous artists of the 19th century, Bouguereau, Gérôme, used photographs and photography in their studios to capture things. Here we can see a Gérôme study compared to one of his photographic references. Bouguereau and Gérôme lied through their teeth about using it. In fact, a famous quote is that this was by a critic, Ernest Lacan, and he said that a painter's relationships to photography was very similar to the relationship to their mistresses. It was like a mistress who they cherished, but they hid. Nobody wanted to know it. Gérôme apparently said at one time of photography, he said, truth has come out of the well. There was this legend that truth, this embodiment of truth, lived in a well, which means it was something that you couldn't easily see. You had to go into the well, and the well is deep and dark, and the implication was that truth was hard to come to. But he said with photography, truth has come out of the well, that we no longer have to struggle to copy things because photography has made it possible. Some artists weren't shy about it at all. Some artists, like the American realist painter Thomas Eakins, was fully embraced it. I mean, he took photographs of references all the time. So he would go out to the Schuylkill River outside Philadelphia, and he would have, some of his models or associates go, play in the water, and then he would produce a painting based on it. He would even do photographs of himself. He actually got himself into trouble. This is actually Thomas Eakins holding a nude model and getting a photograph of it so he could have a reference of it. He was notorious for... It's interesting because in a way he was really rather progressive in his views. People really objected to people drawing nude models, particularly women. They didn't like... there was always a double standard. Men could draw from live nude models, but women couldn't. And Thomas Eakins, to his credit, said, hey, women should have the right to draw from live nude models. But sometimes he took that too far, and there's a story that in order to allow his female art students to understand the human form, he actually stripped naked in front of them so that they could see it. Now we live in the age of Me Too and Zoom calls, so all kinds of things happen. I don't think that would ever go today. But it was clear that he embraced this idea of taking images from life and especially live nude models, and he made sure that his live nude models were also photographed, so he always had a reference to them. And you can see the impact in that in Thomas Eakins' work. When you look at, say, the Crucifixion, look at how harsh the shadows are. This is a painting that looks like a photograph, and painting started to realize that, hey, photography has revealed something about the nature of light and shadow that we never saw before, that seeing it before you in a print forced you to look at something in a different way, and it gave it a more photographic quality. Shadow edges are sharper, shadows and contrast are deeper. This looks almost like an overexposed photo in that regard. Photography also began to move into areas of landscape that we had, just like we had the Hudson River School going out and romanticizing the American landscape, we had photographers going out there. Carlton Watkins, for example, would go out and document large chunks of the American landscape. So did Timothy Sullivan. And you would see that all of this grandeur could now be brought in, and this influenced painters. So they moved into every area and every genre of painting. But the last thing they did is they fundamentally changed how we think of images, particularly in the issue of what we call motion and film grain. Edward Muybridge, for example, was called upon to settle a bet. There was a bet between two individuals in the San Francisco region about whether a horse actually lifted all 4 feet off the ground when it was in full gallop. And there was no way to settle this because the motion of a horse is just too fast for the human eye to catch. But Edward Muybridge said, I might be able to figure this out. And so what he did is he took a series of cameras with trip lines and actually had the horse run past the camera. So he could capture an instant of every part of the horse's motion. And sure enough, it very much does lift all 4 feet off the ground mid-gallop. But more importantly, he had discovered something almost completely by accident, and that was that this gave him a sense of the motion of the horse. Never before had we ever had such a great tool in studying the capacity of motion, and so he quickly started making multiple exposures, again, of new models, of people swinging bats from all directions. He would do multiple exposures of blacksmiths, working so that he could get a sense of motion. And this eventually led to all kinds of technologies, the invention of the film camera and motion technology, but also gave us a much greater sense of how the human figure works and a much greater sense of accuracy in how humans put together. When you look at paintings from the early 19th century and 18th century, it's almost obvious now to see and look at these people and say, if you see someone that's supposed to be in motion, you can look at it and say, that's not somebody really holding the hammer the way a person would hold the hammer if they were swinging the hammer. That's a person standing there holding a hammer over their head, posing because they have to stand still for the artist. But now an artist could capture that, and so instead of somebody just looking posed or stiff, they could look real, they could look genuine. The other thing is film grain, and film grain changes our understanding of what it is that we actually see when we look at an image. We live in an insane age of 4K, incredible pixel depth ratios, where we have touchscreens on phones, where things just, we talk about a retinal level display, a display that can actually capture things to the degree that an eye can see it, and even beyond. And I have to say it, I'm not a fan. We got a 4K TV, and it's just a little disconcerting when you can see the contacts floating around in the eyes of the performers, particularly when it's something like Lord of the Rings, and it's funny, I never would have guessed they had contacts in the Shire, but anyhow, they obviously did. And sometimes you can actually see the reflection of the studio lights, and it's like, this is just too real. We need to back off. Sometimes you can get too real. And what people realized about photography is that photography was made up of grains. Your film substrates, your grounds, are soaked in chemicals. Those chemicals have little crystalline grains, and these are the chemicals that react to light. And if you zoom this up, of course, you can see the actual grain. And so what you're seeing is not an image. It looks like an image when you look at it closely, but when you get closer up, you realize it's actually a series of dots. It's that little grain that exists there. And this was a huge revelation to people because they realized, wow, what you think of as a smooth or a perfected image is actually a series of dots. And you actually are communicating with little gestures and not reality. You can see this in the works of some of these early photographs where people do pictures. And the grain here gives this an added dimension. It shows that you don't have to show everything. That sometimes showing too much is like seeing the contacts that, in the lenses of actors when you're watching a television show in 4K. Now they have 8K televisions. Oh my gosh, it must be nauseating. That you can actually show something that registers as real and authentic, but with very little detail. When you look at this, there's remarkably little detail here. It's just a collection of dots. But those dots actually communicate a quality is real. You actually see Legray goes out and starts taking photos of the seashore. And you have these wonderfully gauzy depictions of the seashore. When you look at these ships, you realize how little is there. These ships are simple silhouettes. There's almost no detail in those dark shadows. They just become silhouettes with just the slightest highlights. And yet that's more than enough to communicate their authenticity, their reality. Photography showed that so much of what we think we see in a picture isn't really there. It is our brain intuiting what we think is there. It is our brain filling in the details. There's no details here. But when you look at this, you look at this, and no one ever looks at this and says, what is that? No, they go, oh, it's ships. It's ships on an ocean. And yet, if you start looking at it, that's an awful lot of black in there, and there's no details in there at all. It's just black. And yet, that's all we need. The silhouette is more than enough to communicate it. You can do more with less. And this is an enormous revelation, because when you look at his photographs, when you see the waves, you realize some of the waves are blurred. Some of the waves are sharp. Detail is very limited. And it's funny because when you talk about illustration today, there's something they talk about, the 80-20 rule, is that 80% of what is in the picture no one is ever going to concentrate on. So don't waste your time on that. Don't waste your time noodling out details as an artist on that 80% of background or ancillary stuff. Focus in on the stuff that's really important. And photography taught this to painters. If you look at an academic style painting from David or Ong, it's insane how much detail is there. Everything. There's no 80-20 rule. It's all 100%. Every square inch of that thing is all the way on. It's 100% 8K, disconcerting amounts of reality and attention to detail. And of course, it's completely wasted. It's unnecessary. When you look at it here, you realize you don't need that. You can focus on some things and let the rest just be gestures. And the brain, the mind, will fill in the rest of the details. So when we start looking at realist painters, which is our next lecture, you see that they've learned this lesson. You see that they've learned that I don't need to paint every glossy detail in that wave. I can leave those brushstrokes blurry, because even when we look at a photograph, they're blurry. I can leave certain things unsaid. And this has an enormous impact on the Impressionists. The Impressionists, more than anybody else, I think, learned the lessons of photography. They learned that you're not seeing actual images. You're seeing dots. And this leads to the invention of what we call the color patch, where our early Impressionists, and this is Impressionism before Impressionism. This is the first Impressionist salon is not until the 1870s. But Monet is clearly experimenting. And look at the water here. If you look at this and just back away from it, it looks like water. I mean, it looks very much like water. The water is such a hard thing to paint. It moves. It's never still. It doesn't want to cooperate. It's reflective but transparent at the same time. It's a real bear to paint. And so he's like, screw all that. We're not going to paint the actual literal thing. What we'll paint is the gesture of it. And we'll do it with a bunch of really blotchy, big, gigantic brushstrokes. I mean, look at these things. And that's all we need. That's all we need, and that will communicate it. It's impossible to see the realists and impressionists making this intuitive leap without the advent of photography. Had photography not come along and taught this lesson to painters, I don't know that they ever would have learned it. It forced them to look at the nature of images in a different way. It forced them to realize, hey, an image is made in your brain. It's not made on the canvas, it's made in your brain. And the stuff that goes through your eye is just the gesture, it's the suggestion of it. And if you can get the suggestion, that's all you need. And you're wasting your time trying to force a painting to do this. And of course, there's one last thing here. There's one last thing that we have to talk about. Paintings could capture realism so well. Why do you need to paint it anymore? This is the last major thing. Painting changes the way we see images. If the goal of a painting is to capture reality, well, why? Because I now have a photograph. A photograph can do that. And so the very last thing that photographs do is they free artists from the need to capture reality at all. A painting is an image. Why does it have to look like reality? And so not only do we get realism and impressionism as a kind of reaction to photography, but we also get post-impressionism, where people realize a painting is a painting. It's the surface, and it should be expressive of what the artist's vision is, and shouldn't necessarily capture reality, because we have something for that. It works wonderfully for that, and it's called photography. And modernism, with its focus away from realism, away from academic naturalism, never would have happened without photography. I'm convinced of this. Okay, so that's all I needed to say on photography. We'll start up next time with realism and impressionism. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.